I see.
Okay, I'm going to start now. Good
Okay.
morning, everyone. Good morning, USA. Good morning, Asia. And good morning or good afternoon, Europe. Welcome to this special session to honor our dear friend, our dear colleague, and our leader, Professor Hao Li. I'm Chris Tang, and it is a privilege to host this session on behalf of our organizing committee with members Wally Hop, Jay Swaminathan, and myself. Also, special thanks to Sushil Gupta, who actually helped me to organize these two sessions. And also, I want to thank Subodha Kumar to help me to get the special issues really running on time and printed and send it to Hao before this conference. Last but not least, I want to thank Kalyan Singhal for actually inviting me to edit a special issue in honor of Hao Li. Before I begin to introduce our virtual speakers, let me say a few words about Hao Li. If I were to recite Hao's many contributions, it would take the entire day. So let me be brief. Hao Li is a leader who inspires others, many others, including myself. So this is a slide that captures some of his colleagues, friends, and some of the papers with his colleagues and students and advisors. Hao Li is the Thoma Professor of Operations, Information, and Technology at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Not only is Hao a leader scholar in OM, he is also widely recognized as a modern Renaissance scholar. He possesses all the hallmarks of a world-leading scholar, including creativity, humility, and compassion. Having foresight is one of Hao's hallmarks. Throughout the last 4 decades, Hao has identified, created, and paved the path for numerous innovative areas of OM research. His research work has inspired researchers like myself to examine novel research ideas in OM. Now, everyone admires Hao, adores Hao. Then the question is, what is his secrets? What is his success recipe? We're going to find out. So today we're going to celebrate Hao's many contributions through his 2 masterpieces. He has many, but I just want to use both, these 2 masterpieces. Both papers are most influential research papers in OM. In the first session, our focus will be on his co-authored paper in 1997, Information Distortion in the Supply Chain, the Bullwhip Effect. This paper was voted as one of the 10 most influential papers in the entire history of the journal Management Science. Also, the Bullwhip paper is one of the most cited OM research articles as of today. Then later on, in the second session, our speakers will be focusing on his later paper in 2004 that was published in Harvard Business Review, the AAA supply chain. This HBR article won the 2nd prize of the McKinsey Award. Without further ado, let me first turn it over to Professor Kalyan Singhal, the editor of POM, to give his opening remarks. Kal, you're on.
Yes, okay. For 30 years, people have been asking me, how did POMS get created? There are 3 things I want to say about Hao. First, he is one of the persons who pushed me into creating POMS, one of the 2. Second, he has contributed more to POMS journal than anyone else. And third, something about all that he has done for the community. In 1988-89, PIMS and ORSA, which is now in POMS, had appointed a committee to evaluate my proposal to create a new journal because I had created a subdivision for TIMS. Two of the members were Howley and Kim Clark. Nobody knew their names at that time. Howley was perhaps an associate professor, and so was Kim Clark, and Kim perhaps did not even have tenure. He later on went on to become Harvard Business School dean. So I had planted both of them with the help of Jim Dyer, but there was a committee and majority of them said, we don't want to create the journal. I then had separate conversation with Kim Clark and Howley. Both told me that we want our own journal. They separately told me. How am I going to do that? Both of them told me the same thing. That's your problem. But if you cannot do it, nobody will do it. You must do whatever you can. I told my wife, Jaya, who is a professor and my co-author, that look, if we do this, our life will be very different. He said, I'm not responsible for that, but I'm willing to give you $400 because that is what I needed to give the money to the lawyer who created the society next day on June 30th, 1989. So this is the history. Now, how edited the first special issue of POMS on supply chain management? We had article by Marshall Fisher, Anand Raman, and lots of superstar scholars. So supply chain started in a journal in POMS, and then he edited a series of articles. Now, before I don't want to forget a few things, I have made notes here. First, we also want to pay tribute to somebody who is as important as Howe today, and that is Maurice Cohen. Maurice Cohen was his dissertation advisor. He became a dissertation advisor because Howley was in another department and his dissertation was not going anywhere. He approached and he changed his life and also Maurice Cohen's life. Maurice, on behalf of the community, we want to thank you. Now, Chris mentioned about top 10 papers in management science. 8 of them were published before 1970, the golden era of management science. Now, 9th paper was a review paper on Lagrangian relaxation by Marshall Fisher. And so Howe's was the only research paper between 1970 and 2004 that made it to top 10 papers in management science. I have a feeling that if you had submitted to a normal issue, I'm not sure whether they would have accepted this kind of a paper because it's a very simple paper. If there is something simple, management science tends to reject it. It has to be a complicated paper in order to get published in POMS journal. And again, I want to thank Marshall Fisher and Steve Graves. They were special issue editors and they were looking for papers that were going to make basic contribution. If you look at the special issue, every article in that issue has a large number of citations. This is a great tribute to Marshall Fisher and Steve Graves about their editorial skills. Now, you look at Howley's credentials. He's a super teacher in MBA program. He's a super teacher in executive development programs. Look at a long list of his publication. He served as editor-in-chief of management science, edited several issues for us. He served as president of POMS. He published in lots of papers in Harvard Business Review and a paper, one or more, in Sloan Management Review. And he's a super consultant. He is a quintessential professor. And I can exhaust all superlatives. And I still will have a lot more to say about him. Now, Chris Tang said, how does he do it? It's not very complicated. It is at the end of the day, accomplishments come from one's values. Howley has as high values, professional and personal, as anyone I have known in the community. Now, 2 more comments. One, he and Kim Clark changed my life I was going to do what all of you are doing, research and consulting career. He killed my consulting career, and research I have started only about 5 to 10 years ago. I'm now catching up, and I should tell you, I'm 75 years old. So I started my research career when I was 65 because of Howley. And second, so I will never know whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, whether How did me a favor or otherwise. I'll never know. But I want to tell how this community and his family, that how has changed the past, present, and future of our community. It is difficult to quantify the benefits of research, but his push to create POMS has perhaps added billions of dollars to the global economy. It has certainly changed the lives of 3,000 or so OM community, and it has perhaps made a huge impact on the global economy. Thank you, How, on behalf of the community. I hope you will continue to do what you have been doing. And I also want once again to thank his family. All right, Chris, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Cal. It's really inspiring. Thank you. Now we're going to learn about the secrets of How's success. Then I was thinking that how can we do that? Then I thought that, well, maybe we can triangulate about Howley's journey in his entire career. So that's why we're going to invite some of his professors, his colleagues, and his students, and his friends to talk about how Howley inspired others, right? So in the first session, we have 5 virtual speakers who will pay tributes to Howley's contribution. We have Professor Marshall Fisher of the UPenn to give his perspectives about Howley as a student. And then we have Professor Jin Wang of Stanford University to talk about How as a colleague. Then moving on, then we have Professor Kamran Moansadat of University of Washington and Professor Panos Kouvelis to share the perspectives. What is How like as a thesis advisor? Then last but not least, we have Professor Chung-Yi Lee of Hong Kong UST to talk about Howley as a leader. Now, let me begin with the first video prepared by Professor Marshall Fisher of the Wharton School.
This plenary session in honor of Howley. A big thank you to Chris Tang for organizing this. I've known How since he was a PhD student at the Wharton School. I've benefited since then enormously from many interactions I've had with How. I have enormous respect for his incredible career accomplishments and great appreciation for all he has contributed to our field. I'll be talking about the bullwhip effect, one of the many things that How is famous for. And in particular, this paper, which rigorously defines the bullwhip effect and proves a number of causes of that effect. This paper was published in a special issue of Management Science that Steve Graves and I co-edited, and I was fortunate to be the one that handled the paper and accepted it, and was thrilled when it was chosen in a process orchestrated by Wally Hopp to identify the 10 most influential papers in management science's first 50 years of history. The paper notes that early identification of the phenomenon of the bullwhip effect, even before it was called the bullwhip effect, were due to Jay Forrester and John Sterman at MIT. So it reminded me that when I was an undergraduate at MIT, I took a course on industrial dynamics, not taught by Jay Forrester, although he did give a guest lecture. And we used a book written by him. And here's a graphic from that book that depicts a supply chain. And then we used a simulation language called Dynamo that would show you what happened. in that supply chain. And this shows, I won't go into the details for obvious reasons, but this depicts volatility of orders as you move upstream. John Sturman has followed in Jay Forrester's footsteps. He's the Jay Forrester Professor of Management and is famous for something called the beer game, which I suspect many of you have either played or run in your classes. It's depicted in the upper panel. A four-stage supply chain begins with the retailer, ends with the manufacturer. People actually sit at a table and play the decide orders and pass them. Right, what you see in the beer game, that the bottom table is retailer demand, which jumps from 4 to 8 and then stays flat throughout the game. And that single jump engenders the kind of volatility that you see in the upper graphs as you move upstream. Now, that's a classroom exercise. This is a slide from a presentation made by P&G talking about the same effect, the bullwhip effect that they see, and they use Pampers as their example, because could you imagine any product where consumer demand was more completely stable, yet by the time that demand gets to P&G, it looks extremely volatile. Here's how, in a classroom context, talking about that phenomenon. And if you look to the left, you see babies demand, and you look to the right, and you'll see P&G demand. I worked with Gerard Cushon on some of Campbell Soup's initiatives. They gave us this slide, which shows a kind of bullwhip effect, that the peak in the consumption actually occurs during the winter months, the way the weeks are identified. But the orders from Campbell's retail customers and their shipments to those customers is vastly more spiky than the actual consumer demand. So back to the paper. They look at a two-stage supply chain with a supplier and a retailer, and they compare the variance in the flow out of the retailer, sales, to variance in the flow into the retailer, what they order on their supplier. And if the supplier variance is greater than the retailer sales variance, that's the bullwhip effect. They make a very interesting point that particularly in the beer game, this crazy volatility as you move upstream, and those of you who played it or run it will relate to this, are due to some emotional, irrational decisions made by people. But this paper says no, it doesn't require irrational behavior. People can be completely rational and optimizing, and we will still see the bullwhip effect. So they start by assuming the four conditions shown there. If you have those conditions, such as stable demand, then you don't get the bullwhip effect. But if any of those assumptions are violated, then you get it for various reasons. For example, if there's a jump in demand, the retailer will raise their target inventory level, so they'll order an amount not just equal to the increase in demand, but an additional amount to cover the increase in inventory. If a retailer knows there's limited supply and is afraid they might not get their order, then they order more than they really want, so that if the order is cut, they get what they want. Fixed order costs, so a retailer seeing weekly or seeing daily demand might order weekly and therefore effectively increasing volatility by a factor of 7. And then particularly in the grocery industry, consumer packaged goods, suppliers will offer promotional discounts periodically. When they do that, retailers will buy as much as a year's supply, called forward buying, when the promotion is offered. So in each of those cases, the paper rigorously defines what is the bullwhip effect and proves that due to these causes, you'll see greater variance in the flow into the retailer than the flow out of the retailer. Gerard Cushon, Taylor Randall, and Glenn Schmidt collected data from the US Census Bureau and used it to measure the variance in flow into and out of various stages of supply chain. This is a portion of a table that gives their results for selected retailers and wholesalers. They looked at both raw data and deseasonalized data. With deseasonalized data, which is an assumption economists often make when they talk about the bullwhip effect, you see it, and everything shown in red there is the bullwhip effect. Those are the cases where flow into the node has greater variance than flow out. With raw data, which they argue is appropriate because the world lives with raw data, not deseasonalized, particularly at the retail level, you don't see the bullwhip effect except for auto. I thought about why. I've worked with a lot of retailers. Christmas, you see a huge surge in demand, so big that the retailer has to prepare in advance by gradually building their inventory in November. So that's a kind of order smoothing where the flow in gradual in November has less variance than the huge flow out over Christmas. Now the paper identifies various things that are being done in industry to fix the problem: everyday low pricing, sharing of data from the retailer to the supplier. Gerard Cushon and I work with Campbell Soup. This depicts their approach. They did that spike I showed you before was due to price discounts. They got rid of those in a certain way. They received data from their retail customers. They formulated the orders and then shipped that product to the customers. Do all of these initiatives work? Well, the Search for Bullwhip paper has this graphic, which suggests, yes, it does, that they had 12 years of data, divided it into 4 3-year buckets. And you'll see, for example, with retailers, the ratio of variance of flow in to flow out has been gradually declining over time. So I'd like to end on a personal note and say thank you, Hao, both for your enormous contributions to our field and for the great privilege of having been your friend over these many years.
Wow, this is a fantastic summary of the bullwhip paper. And thank you for Marshall Fisher for really providing the summary as well as the follow-on study. So now, then if we follow the tradition of Star Wars, then it's a, well, we have to go back to the prequel. In that case, it's let us think about the origin of the bull effect. Now then, who would be the best speaker to talk about the origin of the bull effect, this paper? So we are very fortunate to have Professor Jin Wang of Stanford University to share with us the origin of the bullwhip paper.
So, hello everyone. I am Jin Huang at the Stanford Business School. I'm here to thank Professor Hao Li for his deep contribution to the POM Society and congratulate him on his retirement. I first met Professor Hao Li about 33 years ago on campus, and since then we worked together on 19 projects together, and it was a fun and valuable academic life in my career, and I'd like to personally thank him for the friendship. In fact, according to my colleague, Professor Michael Harrison, as an academic, you need one good friend on campus, and 0 is too lonely, and 2 is redundant. For me, the one good friend on campus is Hao, and that is my deep gratitude to Professor Hao Li. And it was just more than just research together. We met together many times, many times, and discussed many things beyond the research, over the 33 years ago. And we had numerous lunches and dinners. And also we traveled together far and wide. And some cities we visited were Paris, Madrid, Budapest, Kyoto, Chicago, Denver, and many other cities. But among the many trips we made, I recall one trip just distinctively for many reasons. Here's 4 small episodes associated with that trip that still hanging in my memory. And first episode was that it is sort of a Midwest city in the United States, and we arrived late at the airport. And when we arrived and took a taxi to the hotel, and then we asked the cab driver what time it is, but he gave the time. But interestingly enough, he gave a wrong time. That is, it was, he said it is 9 o'clock, but in fact, it was 8 o'clock at night. It is very odd that the local cab driver doesn't know his local time. In fact, that is the first episode. And the second episode is related to the first one. And in the morning, in the following morning, we were supposed to have breakfast together with a manager at the company. And I showed up at 8 o'clock. And I never met him before, but the manager recognized me and then approached me and showed his happiness in seeing me. In fact, I never met him. In fact, as usual, he mistook me for Hao. This confusion happened many times in our 30 years, and then I wanted to correct him by saying that I'm not Hao Li. On the other hand, he would not stop for minutes. And then, I was looking at the elevator, waiting for Hao as a savior from this embarrassing environment, but he would not stop, for 3 minutes. And then about the time I tried to interrupt, in fact, Hao showed up and saved us from this embarrassing moment, in fact. And that is a second episode. And the third episode is at night. We had a series of meetings at the company, and a couple of managers took us to dinner in the local, maybe Chinese restaurant. And then, after the dinner, Hao and I came out of the restaurant, and it was very close to our hotel. So we didn't need a ride. It was pleasant weather. So Hao and I chose to take a walk to the hotel, which is 2 blocks away. While we were walking, we found 2 things. Number one, it was very dark. And number 2, the street was completely empty. But anyway, Hao and I start walking toward the hotel. Then we saw several people, maybe 4 or 5 people on the other side of the block, who were coming toward us. At first, it was just we didn't pay attention, but soon we realized that they were rushing towards us. Well, at first we took a little faster walk, but we realized that they were just trying to come to us by running. Of course, it was a new city for us, and the only thing we could do was we just ran for our lives. And then luckily, we arrived at the hotel before they arrived to us. In fact, it was one of the most tense and memorable event in our life. I bet how we remember this too at this time. That was the third episode. And now comes the fourth episode, the last one. It was about the meeting with the manager at the time. And the manager, he was a director. His name was David, but he was a big guy. And then he shared with us how difficult it is to make a demand forecast based on the wholesale or distributors' orders. In fact, that's the name of the city we visited was Cincinnati, Ohio, and the company we visited was Procter & Gamble. And we heard the story and came back and built a theory around it, and and gave a name to that phenomenon, and we called it the bullwhip effect. And we published the paper in 1997, and that was one of the most memorable research we have ever did together. And of course, in wrapping up, I'd like to thank Hao for the valuable time we spent together as an academic and then as a friend. If I were to be born again and could make a friend made to order, it would be Hao. Hao, thank you very much, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Gene. This is truly inspiring about the history and the origin of the bullwhip effect idea came about. So we learned a lot from this episode. Now, moving on, we are going to learn a little bit about how it's like as a thesis advisor. So we're going to have Hao's former PhD students, Professor Kamran Mohansadat, to talk about his interaction with Hao and how inspiring Hao as a thesis advisor.
I'm honored to give a short talk about Hao's contribution to the field of operations and supply chain management. Let me start by going back to when I was a doctoral student when Hao joined the IEEM, now the MSc department at Stanford. Back in those days, the field was developing, trying to form its own identity as a relevant academic field. There were big debates on how OM was different than OR. Is it production manufacturing management? What is its relevance to business management? Many people in business school argued that OM should be strategy taught by management and OB faculty. Things were very fluid. In a span of 5 to 6 years, as we moved into the 90s, the field started establishing itself as an important and relevant field in business management, distinguishing itself from production engineering and OR. And this was done by some seminal works by brilliant people who provided the direction and the jumpstart it needed. Hao, as a relatively junior faculty at the time, was one of those few to establish the area, and I was privileged to be his very first doctoral student. To me, I feel so lucky that I was in the right place at the right time, as Hao's guidance and teachings as an advisor and a mentor shaped not only my professional life and career, but I must say, as a person. Just imagine with a young Hao, full of energy and motivation. It was quite an experience and a privilege. Let me tell you a short story. I used to work in my office until late, and Hao used to work in office until early evening and then go home. Such arrangement made our progress move swiftly in projects, as I could stop by his office and seek his guidance at will. Sometimes, late at night, when he was not in the office, I would slip my derivations and works under his office door. Those days, I would work till late and then come to school around 8 or 9 or so, which happened to be after Howe would come to office. He was an early bird. He would usually come to office around 7:30ish. So in the mornings, when I would come to school, Howe's feedbacks, suggestions, and so on, was under my office door. Could you imagine having free access to him as a doctoral student? It was quite amazing. And I feel so privileged. By the way, in those days, we didn't have emails and internet, so life was very different. Even we used to handwrite papers, hire a technical typist and pay them. And then, and even after I came to UW, we would correspond our writings through mail. Not long ago, but seems like Stone Age. I remember that when at Stanford, Howe used to tell me that a doctoral student should leave school with a basket of ideas and projects, as things will get rough once real life begins. We all know how junior faculty struggle in their critical initial years, pre-tenure, as they try to produce research while getting used to their new lives as an academic. He also used to tell me that your work should be relevant, and you should always be able to explain and defend it at any venue with different audiences. Those words stuck with me, as upon leaving Stanford, I had a full pipeline of ideas, projects, and works, which made my transition in professional life rather easy. Thank you, Ha, for your advice. After leaving Stanford and upon joining UW, I had 6 top-tier publications with Howe in a span of 4 years, and then started working on other projects with other people. But the agenda and the ideas were heavily influenced through my interactions with him. As we all know, and as it happens to all students and advisors, once those projects were finished, we went our way and always kept in touch. As I watched Howe producing seminal works one after the other and contributing at all dimensions. However, around 5 years back, luck came back my way a second time, and we got to collaborate on 2 exciting projects with one of Howe's most recent doctoral students, Shi Chen. Howe, I took your advice at heart and have always preached them to my students, so your words have gone far beyond your students and have been passed down to others as well. In my opinion, an academic and a scholar should create, advocate, and spread knowledge, inform, mentor, and teach junior colleagues and doctoral students of their important duties and their roles in academia as well as in society. Howe is all of that and more, a true academic in its purest sense and a scholar. I recognized his brilliance shortly after I met him and got affirmation of it to date. Howe is one of the fathers and thought leaders in our field, which is OM and SCM. Aside from all his great scholarly works, which we all know in different areas such as inventory, quality, healthcare, sustainability, etc., what distinguishes and makes him special is that he showcased OM to practice and highlighted its importance to practitioners and outside community. In other words, he made our field relevant. Today, our field is well entrenched with practice, but this was not the case back in the 90s and on the turn of the century. And only a few people, such as Howe, served as ambassadors, introducing the field and its importance to the outside community. I recall that in many meetings with executives from different industries back then, when I was in Seattle, I heard them quoting or referring to him. This clearly was uplifting to me. How was the linkage between academia and the real world when it came to OM and supply chain? Aside from being a mentor and an advisor in an academic sense, I consider Howe as a very close friend. And even today, 35 years later, I reach out for his advice on all aspects of life, and he's always there for me. Howe, in closing, I would like to deliver a message from many of us in the field, and especially those who worked under you as a student. While Panos and Eric will also thank you in person, however, as your first doctoral student, and on behalf of all your former and current doctoral students, I would like to thank you for everything that you did in shaping our academic lives and careers. As a senior member of the OM community, I would also like to thank you for defining many research topics and areas and problems in our field through your great works, introducing our field to outside community and all the service that you provide. You have been an inspiration to all of us. One of the top leaders in our field, and we all cherish and appreciate that. How? I am sure that you still have a lot more to offer and will not stop. As true intellectuals such as you, keep going and will keep contributing. Thank you, Howe.
Thank you, Kamran. This is a very touching speech, and we learn a lot about how inspiring Howe Lee is as a thesis advisor. But I can also add my own personal experience throughout the last 35 years. And Howe and I work on a few number of articles, and quite often people ask me, "Oh, are you Howe Lee's students?" I said, "I wish. I did not have the privilege to be his student, but I had the privilege to work with him and learn from him and also inspired by him." So the next speaker is going to follow this trajectory to talk about Howe's board paper, how to inspire additional work into the risk, supply chain risk management in the context of the pandemic. So the speaker is Professor Panos Kouvelis from the Washington University in St. Louis.
I'm Panos Kouvelis, and I'm going to give a mini lecture on pandemic effects on supply chains, selective lessons for our future resilience. This is part of a plenary session at the Production and Operations Management Society Conference 2021 to honor Professor Howe Lee from Stanford for his retirement. I was a doctoral student at Stanford from 1985 to 88, and Professor Howe Lee was my advisor. I was the third among his doctoral students with a list of prominent scholars of well over 20 doctoral students that he has produced. I co-authored with Professor Howe Lee 4 papers, and actually my first paper in a top journal in operations research in 1991 was co-authored with Professor Howe Lee. Howe Lee has consistently remained a teacher for me, a warm-hearted advisor, an inspiration for our professional accomplishments, and a strong supporter for my career whenever he was needed. First, let's go for our lessons in these pandemic-induced shortages in supply chains. And yes, the bullwhip effect is still the king in supply chains. And you could say the bullwhip cracks louder in the middle of the pandemic. If you look at the figure that is on this particular slide, you can see around March, April, the strong dip in consumption in the markets for many of the durable goods, and then you see the much deeper drop in industrial production. Very small changes in the markets propagates back into the supply chain at a much higher level, and actually you can say the phenomenon is further accentuated in this particular case. What surprised us is how fast for certain goods the demand came back and how much stronger was than what was really expected. And that drove a very serious bullwhip that we see these days, especially in March of 2021. And everybody is talking about the massive chip shortages, the semiconductor chips that are affecting many industries, in particular the car industry. So if you start looking, let's say, motivated by this latest incident, the global shortages of semiconductors, you can clearly see the bullwhip phenomenon, how it unfolded. In the spring of 2020, of course, lockdown and expectations of seriously dropped demand had companies shutting down factories and trying to deplete inventories and stop placing orders, which starts propagating back into the supply chain and hitting the suppliers, which now they have to adjust at massive levels of 50 and 80 and 100%. At the same time as this is happening, especially talking about semiconductor chips, there are certain products that in the new environment actually they have very strong demand. These are your home entertainment devices and your computers and your phones and your game consoles and so on. Those are companies that now start hoarding most of the semiconductor capacity there. And of course, in the car industry, the expectation is that the demand is not going to come back as fast, but that is not really true because suddenly we see in summer of 2020 the demand for cars going up. And of course, as the demand is going up, they have to adjust for the new level of demand, at the same time replenish their inventories. These huge orders that go back to the semiconductor suppliers. What now they're going to find is some of the capacity already being hoarded by other players, and the capacity is very tight. The demand was rather unexpected, both in terms of how fast it came and how strong it is, and that drives a very serious bullwhip phenomenon that is going to last for another 4 to 6 months. And it is, the whip is really cracking louder because there are some extra accentuating factors that are going to play into it. We have the logistical constraints with losses of air cargo capacity, some limitations due to labor issues in some of the port operations, and of course a highly strained tracking capacity in the adjustment of supply chains between industrial usage and retail usage products. And of course, the labor issues and some capacity might be also affected for other parts of the supply chain. So yes, the whip in this time was heavily unexpected in terms of how fast and how strong was the demand when it came back, and it encountered very tight capacity conditions accentuated by the factors that I just mentioned. So of course, during the pandemic, we had an opportunity to see this heavy shift of demand away from the usual industrial uses and food services going towards more consumer products and retail markets. And we saw that for toilet paper and paper towel, we saw that in flour and yeast, and of course, the moving away from kegs and using a lot of cans associated with beverages. So everybody started talking about our supply chains being extremely efficient. They were not only extremely efficient, but they were focused by segment. So for these functional goods, we have segment efficiency focused supply chains that what we discover is they don't have the necessary flexibility as you are adjusting the mix of products in the presence of the pandemic. And that's when we realized the hidden bottlenecks, many of them in packaging, and some of the distribution and transportation logistics capabilities within supply chains. So everybody talks about an efficiency curve. I would like to talk about the lack of operational flexibility to adjust to the needed mix, which is a major concern for supply chains. And of course, as we all have experienced, this is unprecedented hoarding behavior you have ever seen that drove this big demand peak in some of the functional goods supply chains like toilet paper. And we were hoping that it was not going to last very, very long, but unfortunately the hoarding behavior was at a level we have never seen before. March of 2020 has the record of actually March 12 of 2020, the increase in demand of toilet paper relative to a year before that, it was 734%. And 70% of retailers, including online retailers, were out of toilet paper. And you all saw it, it was video stream, you saw it in the social media, in the middle of a pandemic, an unprecedented once-in-a-lifetime event. We were all fearful, and imagine it, we were fearful we ran out of toilet paper. And of course, when you're in the middle of the crisis and you read the surveys of executives, everybody is talking about how we need to build resilience in supply chains, and they're ready and motivated and so on. But now, as we're coming closer to hopefully will be the end of the pandemic and we start seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, now the talk is a little more about how many of these investments are expensive and very hard to justify for our publicly traded companies. So everybody likes to talk about the need to make trade-offs between efficiency and resilience, but what I really see is a pendulum where the talk goes from the one extreme, all about resilience, to the other extreme, that actually resilience is expensive and efficiency is what we need to focus again. And of course, for one more time, we revisited the issue of using global supply chains with long lead times away from our markets. And always we're going to argue that there are economic factors that create this concentration of manufacturing capacity in labor pools and supplier bases in China and Southeast Asia, and how we have thought about these long lead time supply chains. But now we had an opportunity to see how these long lead time supply chains affected us in the presence of this serious risky event of the pandemic, and how other non-market factors increase the risks of those long lead time supply chains. Political risk, with governments having agendas and trying to hoard capacity and material for their own markets, tariffs that impeded trade flows, and as a result we didn't have the level of inventories that we needed for some of our raw materials or access to capacity that was necessary to respond to the event, and of course the rather serious logistics bottlenecks we faced. So all these non-market factors, non-market frictions, showed that these long lead time supply chains are quite vulnerable, and it's very hard for us to respond to the events, especially when we find out that these global supply chains didn't have the level of operational buffers, especially from the raw material side, closer to their markets, and they had not reserved enough logistic capacity in order to deal with this severity of logistical constraints they faced. So lots of lessons out there, lots of observations. Of course, the question is how are we going to come up with resilient solutions? And I will just go a little at a high level and touch upon a few ideas, but I will not elaborate in the details of it. Definitely, the inflexible functional good segment of efficient focused supply chains that they cannot respond to demand shifts to the change in the product mix is something we need to correct. Might be corrected with flexible automation. We got to rethink how we structure our processing tasks and create modularity, some generic, some more flexible and custom, and the need definitely on the processing to trade off some efficiency for flexibility and smaller scale. And of course, on the input side, we got to use generic inputs that with a little further processing can be transformed into the inputs that are needed for segments and provide the substitution flexibility that is necessary. Definitely, we need to think about these constraining resources we have on the distribution and transportation. And these are assets that are shared across more than one company, a whole industry or a region. So therefore, we got to start thinking about how we are going to coordinate these larger systems, the industry, the region, with respect to these type of assets, and how industry associations, professional associations, or private, public, cooperative enterprises to be working together with governmental agencies will better invest and manage these type of assets. And strategic inventories that have to go beyond just the oil industry and the pharmaceuticals, but we need to talk about strategic inventories of other imported material and other resources that are needed in order to respond in the crisis. And again, is a bigger system where the governments and the industry corporations have to come in and start making these type of investments. In a smart investment type of an approach where it could be everyone is buying options and pays for some of the options in order to reserve some of those resources and later pays for the execution and the smarter allocation of the resources as they are needed. The supply chain management professional community should be internally grateful to Professor Hao Li. Professor Hao Li will never retire in our eyes, in always being the inspirational scholar, learning through his writings, always teaching us through the beautiful papers that he has out there about the beauty of supply chain theory and the impact that can have in practice, always energizing our community with his ideas for sustained impact, and at the personal level, exemplifying what a sharing person can be, how generous he has been with his time, and how he always fought to create a community that came together for the common good and sustain a professional community of big impact. At the personal level, I'm personally grateful to what has been the best mentor, the warm-hearted advisor, and the strongest professional supporter I could have ever had in my career. I owe a very lot of my success to his inspiration and support. Professor Hao Li, thank you. I'm Panos Kouvelis.
Thank you very much, Panos. And I think your speech is so engaging, and also the video is fantastic. And also that you share about how inspired you to lead a very successful career. And thank you for sharing with us. Last but not least, we're going to have a next speaker to talk about from bullwhip effect, how it's related to ocean freight. And because how is a Renaissance man. His work is inspire people to not just the traditional OM, but also in the transportation services as well. So now let me turn it to Professor Chong-Yi Lee of Hong Kong UST.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chong-Yi Lee from Hong Kong UST. It is my great pleasure to make this presentation to honor our dear friend, Professor Hao Li, the father of supply chain management, for his great contribution in our field. Today, I'm going to share with you some of our recent research in ocean transport logistics management. This is a very important area, as about 80% of world trade are through ocean transport, and it incurs huge inventory costs during to long transit time. Hence, it is a very important area, yet it is significantly understudied in POM. Most literature either study the efficiency improvement of port operation or in maritime economics. Our recent research focuses on linking it to supply chain management to meet the standard of being agile, adaptable, and aligned. So today I'm going to share with you some of our research. I was invited to conduct a keynote speech in INFON's 2010 annual conference in Austin, Texas, in this topic. And 1 year later, I was start to conduct and in charge a big project sponsored by Hong Kong government that involves several universities and multi-nations. Today, I'm going to share with you some of our research outcome. The first paper actually with Professor Hao Li and my colleague Ji-Heng Zhang. It is interesting to see in this industry, the vessel fuel cost consumption function is cubically proportional to velocity. So it is a common practice that use the so-called slow steaming. Let me keep the speed as low as possible. The question is, if you have a delay in the previous port, then how can you speed up to catch up the schedule to maintain the delivery reliability? Of course, you don't want to sacrifice too much the fuel consumption. So we developed a model to quantify the relationship among shipping time, fuel consumption cost, and delivery reliability. Based on the historical data of a big company, our model can say huge consumption cost. The next paper is with Professor Christian and colleagues. It's about a risk sharing pricing strategy. A shipper can either sign a contract with a fixed price for the whole year, that's the blue line here show you, or they use a spot market, which is usually seasonal and very volatile. From the carrier point of view, they will prefer the fixed price model because they can lock in the market share earlier. And it's good for their capacity planning. However, the shipper may not be willing to do because when the spot market is very low, they obviously share a huge risk. You can see that this part, the fixed price is higher than the spot market price. So the carrier was thinking about to develop a so-called fraction model, pricing model, such that when the spot market is lower than the fixed price, they are willing to share the risk by reduce a little fraction part. So gamma is the fixed price, beta is the fraction to reduce the cost. So we are able to come by optimal solution, gamma star and beta star, such that the shipper are willing to accept this fraction model and without sacrificing the carrier's expected revenue. The next paper actually is based on my PhD students' dissertation and also with Professor Yang Fan Su. It's about a shipping carrier portfolio management. You want to ship a seasonal product to a destination. Assume that you have two carriers to choose. One is fast by expansion and it's fast, reliable, and expansion. Another one is cheaper but slow and maybe unreliable. The question is, compare about shipping costs as well as the inventory holding cost because long transit time, and also it's a seasonal product. If you deliver delay, then will be out of date, out of fashion, so it's huge cost there. So we concern about inventory costs as well as shipping costs. So we need to balance shipping costs and inventory costs. We develop an optimal carrier portfolio, consider both factors for management demand uncertainty and uncertain arrival time. The next paper is with Professor Xu Zhou in Hong Kong Poly. It's about the continuous berth allocation problem. When a vessel arrives at port, we need to allocate a berth for their part. We want to minimize total turnaround time, and the berth is available on a limited space. So this problem actually is similar to, actually more complicated than the classical two-dimensional beam packing problem, where the space and the time are two corresponding dimensions. So the question is, this is a classical problem, so many solutions already exist. However, the approach usually is they formulate the problem as an integer programming, then relaxation, use linear relaxation to find out the solution that is lower bound. Unfortunately, the lower bound and the upper bound or the optimal solution, the gap is very huge. So we were able to develop a new and normal formulation for the relaxation problem to come up much better new lower bound, and so we can solve the solution optimally, problem optimally, and with a larger problem and much less time. The last paper I would want to share with you also with Professor Xu Zhou and a student. This is to be appear in this POMS special issue to honor Professor Howley, and this is about again global liner service procurement. You remember paper 3, we concerned about one destination only 2 carrier to choose. In here, we have a set of carrier and a set of land. Then you can ship to many destinations, many land available, and so many schedule. And again, demand is uncertain. So if you don't have available schedule to ship, then you need to use the spot market rate, usually higher. So our decision is to select the carrier and a lane, and then allocate container to schedule. This problem is of course very complicated because we consider about all the practical constraints. Our objective is to minimize the total cost. Of course, this problem can formulate as stochastic programming problem. However, that becomes intractable. So we use the so-called two-stage robust optimization problem to solve. We minimize total cost for the worst case in a given uncertain state. In this case, we don't need to find out the actual demand distribution. We can relax it, and it's more tractable than stochastic programming. Again, first stage and second stage, as I mentioned already, assign the select carrier lane and then allocate the problem. So here is the detailed formulation mathematical. You can see here is the given uncertain set that under that state. The first stage is to minimize the total worst case cost and minimize F RPYG. And then second stage is try to find FRPIZ is the maximum all possible scenario. And then minimize the whole total cost. So this problem obviously is very complicated, intractable. Okay, it's difficult to solve. Fortunately, we were able to develop a solution method for this robust optimization based on the reformulation. We reformulated the second stage. You remember in the second stage, it's a minimum problem. We reformulate such that become a maximum problem. Then the two stages become a maximum two stage. And then again, we reformulate, transform it to become a one stage minimum problem. We then use constraint generation method to solve. We also conduct an experiment to demonstrate the effectiveness of this problem. Due to time constraint, I'm very sorry that I went through all the paper very fast. So here I'm also providing one book we edit and 2 review papers for your reference if you are interested. Now come to the challenge and opportunity. In terms of short-term challenge, clearly congestion in the port is a big problem now because huge day in the port due to the pandemic period, as well as the shortage of container and shipping space, no container available, no shipping space available to ship. Also, recently the price jumped 3 times or 4 times. That's also a big problem. In terms of long-term challenging opportunity, how to apply big data, AI, as well as blockchain application in this area. Also, green shipping in consider environmental issue, as well as automation, because this industry traditionally is a very old technology. Now with IT development and all technology development, make the automation become possible. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Please stay healthy. Hello, everyone. I'm Chong-Yi Lee from Hong Kong, US.
Thank you, Hao. Thank you, Chong-Yi Lee, for sharing the videos with us. And then we learned a lot about how bull effect has really also exists in a lot of industries, including the ocean freight. And this concludes our first part of the sessions in honor of Hao Lee. We're going to take a break. In real time, I think that we have to resume here at 8:30 East Coast time. That means 7 to 7 minutes, so that I can load up the second part of videos. I hope I can do it within 7 minutes. And then we'll resume the second part in 7 minutes. And thank you very much. We'll see you later.
delighted to have the opportunity to share with you.
Okay, welcome back. We're going to start the second session. So in the first part, we talk about how these work in this.
Chris, you have
Yes.
two of your cameras on. So you want to shut one of those systems down, otherwise the sound is garbled.
Okay. Is it better?
That should work.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, welcome back to the second sessions of our special session to honor Hao Li. In the second part, our speakers will be focusing on his 2004 Harvard Business Review article, The AAA Supply Chain. Now, AAA stands for Agility, Adaptability, and Alignment Supply Chains. Now, actually, after Hao Li worked on his bullwhip paper in 1997, later on, the supply chains become more vulnerable, as we've seen and observed after September 11. Then he realized that the efficient supply chain will no longer be sufficient. We need to expand the scope and the measurements and performance of the supply chain to go beyond efficiency. So therefore, agility, adaptability, and alignment supply chains will become crucial in order to sustain the success of other supply chain operations. So in these sessions, we have 4 speakers. Alida Roth apologized because of personal health. She cannot join us today, but I will say a few words on her behalf later on. So we have 4 speakers who will pay tributes to Hao Li's contributions in the context of AAA supply chains. First, we have Hao Li's thesis advisor, Morris Cohen of UPenn, to give his perspective about Hao Li as a student. Then we have his dear friends, colleagues, and co-authors to talk about Hao's inspirational contributions to our field through different speeches given by David Simchi-Levy from MIT, Jan Fransu from Tilburg University, and Eric Johnson from Vanderbilt University. So I'm going to share the new video given by Professor Morris Cohen.
I'm delighted today to have the opportunity to share with you the paper that I co-authored with Panos Kavelis for the POMS conference to honor Hao Li. Let me first give you some background. I first met Hao when I was a much younger assistant professor, and Hao was a doctoral student at Wharton's operations research program. One day, Hao knocked on my door, introduced himself, and asked me if I would consider being his thesis advisor. I said yes. It was probably the best professional decision I ever made. From the beginning, it was clear to me that Hao was destined to do great things. Today, he's recognized as a supply chain rock star, and he's had a lasting impact on our field. Hao and I have worked together over a wide range of projects and continue to work together to this day. Let me now move to the paper that I want to present today. It's based on Hao's famous AAA supply chain paper published in 2004 in the Harvard Business Review. After 17 years, it continues to be both relevant and impactful. Our paper, one that Panos and I wrote, builds on the AAA framework and presents some adaptations that have been motivated by recent events. So let us proceed with the paper. First, let's define the 3 elements of the AAA model. They are agility, adaptation, and alignment. Agility responds in the short term to disruptions and changes. Adaptation, longer-term changes involving redesign of things like strategies, products, and technologies. And alignment involves incentives to achieve better performance. We're concerned with three questions today. Is AAA still relevant? We would say absolutely yes. Why should we change? What has happened? Well, as we all know, a lot has happened recently. Everything from technology change, the COVID crisis, government interventions, and so on. And the question is, how should we change it? It was clear from Howe's research that companies had to implement all three, not just one of these dimensions, in order to be successful. And what Panos and I decided is that we would maintain the framework, but modify it by adding an R in front of each of the A's. So let's begin by looking at agility, which is defined here as the ability to react to short-term changes. It's implemented originally by a variety of strategies, which are listed here, which we're all familiar with and which have been effective. In order to achieve robust agility, companies have to build on those strategies and continue to use them. But now they have to respond faster. They have to expand the range of scenarios and disruptions that have to be considered. And they have to develop ex-ante implementable contingency strategies that are tailored to the actual product architecture and the supply chain structure. We've seen a wide variety of reactions of firms to the COVID crisis involving product mix and pricing and packaging distribution, but for the most part, supply chains have been able to respond to the COVID crisis in the short term. Let me discuss one example that we're all familiar with, which is toilet paper. There was a major shortage of toilet paper that occurred in supermarkets, even though we could argue that the overall capacity for manufacturing toilet paper and the demand for toilet paper had not changed. What had changed was the distribution and mix of demand did change dramatically overnight because institutional users such as schools and companies were no longer using it, they were shut down, and home use has increased significantly. So what did companies do? What they did is they repackaged to home use size and they adjusted distribution in real time to exploit pooling. But product design and overall capacity did not have to change. Let's consider the second A, adaptation. Again, here are listed a number of ideas and strategies which have been successfully implemented. And what resilient adaptation is to build on those, but in ways that expand the horizon that we're considering, to use more comprehensive models to look at a wider range of cost trade-offs, not just single dimensions like labor costs, and to have a framework for adaptation that's based on lessons learned. The focus has to go beyond supply disruption to consider other kinds of disruptions, such as demand shocks and innovations. And finally, we have to understand that there are significant barriers to achieve resilience. What we've learned through a study that Panos and I were involved in is that with involved interviewing over a dozen companies, is that the basic roadmap of supply chain resilience, what has to be done, is generally well understood, but implementation execution remained a challenge. And in this study that I mentioned, we identified a number of these barriers, which I basically won't go through, but they basically indicate what has to be overcome in order to achieve resilience. Finally, let's look at alignment, which is the third A, which we now relabel as realignment. The original idea was based on information exchange, the definition of roles, tasks, and responsibilities, and using sharing risks, costs, and gains in an equitable fashion. Under realignment, companies now have to expand their scope to look at interdependence across industries. They have to consider things like environmental impact, social responsibility. An ecosystem perspective is appropriate. This involves expanding the number of stakeholders and partners and ways in which they interact. And there are some specific strategies that we've identified that are associated with alignment. One is performance-based logistics, which is a contracting mechanism to align incentives, which has been adopted in the US by the defense industry and has been used successfully there and now is being used in other industries. And the other one is to adopt new business models, which involve the ownership and control and coordination and incentives within the supply chain. Two examples: vendor managed inventory and customer managed inventory. Vendor managed inventory involves shifting decision rights from customers to suppliers, sharing information, fixing pricing. Customer managed inventory involves the opposite, shifting decision rights from the supplier to the customer. One example is Boeing and the Dreamliner, which had a significant shortage of fasteners, which led them to take over the ordering decisions of their suppliers. So finally, we note that the AAA framework has stimulated over the years a lot of highly relevant supply chain research. We concluded our paper by noting some future research directions. Let me just focus on one or two of them. One has to do with tools and methodologies for scenario planning. This involves identifying those impactful future scenarios and identifying or developing policy options to deal with them, to mitigate the risk. This goes beyond the traditional methodology of coming up with a forecast and then having that as an input to an optimization model, but involves more detailed analysis of these specific scenarios and policies. This involves exploiting big data, which means using machine learning and artificial intelligence methodologies, and essentially optimizing the use of the data. So, and there are others listed here. Anyhow, thank you for your attention, and that's it.
Thank you so much for Morris Cohen for providing a very interesting talk and how AAA supply chain can be expanded the scope to include robustness, resilience, and realignment in the new era. Now, also, I want to make a remark. Usually, it's the students pay tribute to the advisor. But in this particular case, it's truly amazing that the thesis advisor, some work is actually motivated by his students. So in this case, it shows how special Howley is. So our next speaker is no exception. Is David Simchi-Levy from MIT. And he's going to talk about how this kind of work, like how this AAA supply chain is linked to the supply chain risk management. Here's David Simchi-Levy.
Hello, everybody. My name is David Simchi-Levy. It's a pleasure to participate in the POMS plenary session in honor of Professor Howley. I'm going to talk about supply chain risk management. But before I start the discussion, let me talk a little bit about my relationship with Howley. I've known Howley for many, many years. He served as a mentor. He has been a long time a friend, and he inspired many of us in academia, but also I know in industry as a supply chain researcher and a supply chain innovator. But the most important thing he has done for our field is pushing operation management into a new frontier where we make impact both on theory and practice. What I would like to do today is talk a little bit about what I learned from Howley and how I applied this insight into my own research. And the example that I'm going to use is in the area of supply chain risk management. If you look at the last 10 or 15 years in supply chain, you see dramatic success stories, impressive success stories achieved by companies that were able to cut costs from their supply chain using strategies like lean, like outsourcing, like offshoring, and like consolidation. All these strategies allow companies to increase efficiency, but these same strategies that allow companies to cut cost dramatically increase exposure to risk in the supply chain. And we have seen the impact of this increase in risk after events like the tsunami in Japan and the flood in Thailand in 2011, or events like the volcano eruption in Iceland in 2010, affecting companies in a variety of industry, from the automotive industry through pharmaceutical, all the way to the high-tech industry. Things have changed, of course, in the last 12 months. In the middle of February, I submitted a short paper to Harvard Business Review. The paper was published online on February 28, where it attracted a lot of attention. In 4 days, it received more than 170,000 clicks. What did we say in this paper that attracted so much attention? Remember, the paper was submitted in mid-February. Here is what we said, that the peak of the impact of COVID-19 on global supply chain will happen in mid-March, forcing thousands of companies to shut down or reduce manufacturing and assembly activities in the US and in Europe. And this is exactly what happened. On March 17, we saw newspapers around the world reporting that European automotive companies are shutting down. MIT reported on March 25th that the previous week, the week of March 17, many companies in a variety of industries were forced to shut down activities in the US. So what did we do that allow us to predict a shutdown in mid-March? I use a model that I developed 8 years earlier, the risk exposure model. This model was developed and applied at the Ford Motor Company. It was published in Harvard Business Review. And I want to describe quickly the key ideas behind this model and how operation management and operation research allow companies to develop models that can identify hidden risk in the supply chain and help also determine effective mitigation strategies. So you see here an illustration of for the supply chain. We develop 3 important concepts. The first one is what I call time to recover, which is the time it takes to recover to full functionality after a disruption. We remove a node from the supply chain for the duration of the time to recover. And the time to recover, of course, depends on the scenario. And then we use an optimization engine to estimate performance impact, which is the impact of disruption during time to recover on the company bottom line, on Ford revenue, on Ford profit, or on Ford market share. And when we can do it facility by facility, node by node, it provides us with detailed information about risk exposure, the impact of disruption anywhere in the supply chain on business performance. And you can see, for example, data from Ford supply chain. In this figure, I am showing information on the y-coordinate on annual spend at a supplier side. This is spent by Ford at each one of its tier 1 suppliers. And on the x-coordinate, I'm focusing on performance impact, in particular lost profit. You can see, for example, when you look at the top of this figure, a strategic supplier. This is a supplier where Ford spend significant amount of money every year. And of course, you can see that this is a risky supplier, but risk is moderate. The impact is not the highest. The highest risk suppliers are suppliers at the bottom right-hand side. These are relatively small suppliers, but if they are disrupted, huge impact on business performance. For example, if you look at this supplier, this is a supplier that provides Ford with components that cost 20 cents. But if this supplier is disrupted, huge impact on bottom line. That's why I say in supply chain, risk is hidden in unexpected places. The second insight from the implementation at Ford and the application of the methodologies that we develop is looking at, it comes from this figure. Here in this interface, we show the location of Ford tier 1 suppliers. Each bubble represents a tier 1 supplier. The size of the bubble is proportional to exposure to risk that is driven by this supplier. Different colors are used here to indicate higher or lower level of risk. Blue represents a risk exposure higher than a certain threshold. You can see that the risky suppliers are everywhere. They are in North America, they are in Europe, and some are in Asia. That's why I say risky suppliers are not necessarily in one region. They are everywhere. And this also suggests that just moving manufacturing facilities from one country to another by itself is not going to provide a resiliency level to the supply chain. The last insight comes from another concept that we developed and implemented at Ford. Remember, I mentioned time to recover. I should also mention the concept of time to survive. What is the time to survive? We look at a specific facility and we ask, how long can the supply chain match supply with demand without that facility? It's not zero, because the supply chain, the pipeline is full with inventory, but we can estimate this. We can determine time to survive. Again, here is data from Ford tier 1 suppliers. On the X coordinate, I'm presenting time to survive in weeks. On the Y coordinate, the number of suppliers. As you can see, this figure suggests an opportunity and a challenge. The challenge is on the left-hand side. These are suppliers where time to survive is very short. If any of them is disrupted, big impact on bottom line. On the right-hand side, we have suppliers where time to survive is very long. Why it's very long? Because Ford is sitting on a lot of inventory. This is a cost-saving opportunity. That's why in Insight 3, I emphasize facilities with short time to survive will have immediate performance impact, whereas facilities with long time to survive provide saving opportunities. And so let me close by highlighting a few developments that have happened in the last 12 months. The first is in April 2020, I published a short article in Harvard Business Review emphasizing the need to develop and implement stress tests for critical supply chain. I identified a number of critical supply chain from healthcare to life science to food. And I identified lessons that we can take from the financial industry that can apply to supply chain resiliency. And the main lesson is that after the financial crisis of 2008, the federal government in the US and government in Europe established stress tests that banks need to apply in order to make sure that they are ready for the next financial crisis. Based on this and the methodology and the analytics developed by my team at MIT, MIT and Accenture signed a partnership in October of 2020 to implement supply chain resiliency and stress test technology across a variety of industries. And indeed, the Biden administration just issues an executive order in February of this year that seeks to assess critical supply chain, and in particular, the level of resiliency in the current supply chain and design strategies that allow us to be better prepared for the next crisis. So what I'm highlighting in this example of the research that we have done at MIT is that focusing on new methodology, focusing on new analytics, not only is exciting from the research point of view, but it can also have enormous impact, not only on a specific company, but across companies, industries, and in this case, impact on national security industries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David Simchi-Levy, for sharing your insights about how supply chain risk management is also even more relevant in during this crisis, pandemic crisis. So now we're moving on to the next speaker. In the next speech, Professor Jan Fransu is going to talk about how AAA supply chain is applied to Nano-stores. That is little stores in different markets. And then he talked about that the AAA should be expanded. The 3 measures is not enough, should be 5 A's. We need to include affordability and accessibility, especially in the emerging markets. This is what he has to say.
Hello, my name is Jan Franso, and in this brief presentation I will share with you how Rafael Escamilla, Christine and myself see the concept of AAA supply chains being extended to actually 5 A's: agility, adaptability, alignment, accessibility and affordability, and how this concept is actually very relevant in the world's largest retail channel, the Nano-stores in the developing world. These little stores, mom and pop operated, they actually are the world's largest retail channel. We estimate there's about 50 million of these stores globally, and they serve about 4 billion consumers, typically at the bottom of the pyramid. The stores are highly relevant because for most consumer goods companies globally, this is the channel that's still growing due to urbanization and due to the urban poor actually getting access to a little bit more money. There are many challenges in the supply chain serving the Nano-stores. So we could think of infrastructural challenges, operational and financial challenges. And also these challenges might be different in the urban landscape, where actually now most of the consumers in the developing world are living, and in rural Nano-stores that are still very prominent in some parts of Africa and South Asia. In terms of infrastructural challenges, what we see is items like poor cell phone coverage or expensive data plans in the city. So despite digitization actually happening, and happening at a fast pace, this is being hampered by this lack of infrastructure. In the countryside, what we see is a lack of road, access to electricity, and also access to telecommunications infrastructure. Operationally, we see complex and fragmented distribution challenges in the city. Cities are often congested, there's limited parking available. So logistics, we see many challenges there on the operations side. In rural Nano-stores, this relates to limited operating hours and a lack of formal distribution channels, as suppliers may not reach out to the countryside to serve stores that are very remote. Financially, we see that both in urban and rural settings, that cash is still the predominant mode to conduct transactions. Digitization is a big opportunity, but much of the transactions are still conducted in cash. Also, Nano-stores have a lack of access to credit, and this actually implies that it's difficult for them to keep their cash flow growing. There are, however, many interesting developments, and much of that is also reflected in the research that's happening. The basic characteristics of Nano-stores have been described in a book that I was co-editor of, that appeared in 2017, and that's a good introductory reading into the Nano-store landscape. The operations have been studied in a series of papers. There's much more appearing now, where, for instance, items such as selection of the distribution channel or cooperative buying is being studied. In terms of cash constraints and trade credit issues, Ayer and Paul Desai have done an interesting study where they looked at the system of intermediaries that is present in India. And Bulek and Van Wijk have studied the attractiveness of giving trade credit by suppliers. And finally, we now see some studies appearing looking at the competition within and across channels, as Nano-stores are competing with each other, manufacturers are competing to serve these stores, and also Nano-stores are competing with the modern channel. And some interesting studies have appeared, and studies are still ongoing. Now, new technologies and business models actually play a very important role in this change. And if we take Howley's AAA as a starting point, the adaptability is the first A, which means supply chains need to adapt over time as market structures and strategies evolve. Now, this evolution happens, for instance, with Amazon and in India, who have developed a program called I Have Space, where the Nano-stores actually take care of the last mile delivery. So Amazon delivers to the stores. Consumers can choose to pick up, but more often than not, actually the shopkeeper who knows the consumers in the neighborhood takes care of delivery to consumers, either by foot or by two-wheeled vehicle. Agility is the ability to react speedily to sudden changes in demand or supply. And Sokowatch, operating in East Africa, is a company that actually is able to deliver within 2 hours to the Nano-stores of cities just like Nairobi or Kampala, with these little vehicles, and providing this as a service to dozens of manufacturers. Interestingly, because they're able to give such a quick supply, also it makes it for shopkeepers much easier to predict the available cash. So a typical problem that's often seen as in missed deliveries is not visible here. And finally, in terms of alignment, many manufacturers, they actually have an incentive to ensure that this channel remains alive and remains competitive, because they realize a larger margin there. And Grupo Bimbo have developed a technology concept called Red Cubo, where they equip Nano-stores with technology that allows the Nano-stores to sell additional services like telephone top-ups, or accepting cash payments. And this is quite interesting, because this increases the amount of cash that is ongoing, that is going around, being generated in the stores, and that's of benefit to Bimbo because of the increased competitiveness of their main channel and most profitable channel. In the rural countryside, there are new technologies and business models as well. And we have accessibility, for instance, being increased by Coca-Cola, who have developed their EcoCool fridges, which are solar-powered fridges that allow the stores to offer Coca-Cola bottles refrigerated. But moreover, this unit is also able to provide electricity such that the store can sell additional services like charging of cell phones. Another example is the Hapinoi program, which has been described extensively by Chris Teng, which are buying cooperatives of stores where they buy their product together, rural stores traveling together to the city to buy products, and in that way reducing the operational cost and allowing them to offer more affordable products in terms of lower prices to consumers. There are many research opportunities to conclude. Because we have multiple stakeholders with different goals, this provides for an interesting analysis. We think of consumers. They would like affordable access to basic products and services. The stores themselves, they want to survive, to subsist, support their families while working from home. And this provides actually a different perspective of the Nano-stores themselves in terms of, for instance, their objective function. Suppliers, they have an opportunity to grow the market and optimize their supply chain, which provides for lots of interesting new challenges to study in this different institutional context. Public authorities want to reduce the adverse effects, for instance, of this fragmented distribution leading to congestion or pollution. And finally, we have many tech companies entering this market. Think of Facebook and Amazon that want to capture this huge unexplored market. Also, Alibaba is very active with innovative concepts like the Ling Xiaotong concept. The interesting element, if you look at this channel, is that this is about business. It's about growing business, but also it's about contributing to many of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm very happy to see much research emerging using a variety of different methods, such as formal modeling, but also econometrical studies and field experiments. This implies that Howley's concept of the AAA is still very much alive. It illustrates how innovation can be driven using the perspective of AAA and actually enhancing this. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I'd like to thank Hao for bringing this concept forward and for helping to show us that this is still very much live. Hello, my name is
Thank you for sharing your perspective about how AAA supply chain can be extended to affordability and accessibility in Nano-stores supply chains. So Jan-François has really given us a new area how to apply Howley's framework, the AAA supply chain. Now, the next person is actually wanted to submit the video, but because her personal health, and I think she has some difficulty to do the recording, this is Alida Roth. So she was supposed to submit a written statement for me to read, but then I did not receive it. So instead of showing her video or her text, maybe I can take the privilege to share about what I think she would have written about Hao. Both Hao and I really serve on different things, and but then I realized that Hao is also a unique person, not just in terms of relevant work, it's also diversity. He is a strong believer in terms of diverse opinion, diversity in the different groups that can stimulate, spark new ideas. So the two levels of diversity I would like to share with you. The first one is a diversity in terms of methodology. See, in our community, I think that people are divided into separate groups. Either you do analytical work, you do empirical work, or you do behavioral experiments work. But how always embrace all methodology. So that would be like he's very proud of Osa, Karen Zhang. They work on a behavioral experiment in OM, which is really leading us to think about new areas, which is fantastic. Also, in terms of empirical work in OM, and I think that he has done some work, and also with Li Chen and all this. So this is, I think, as a community, we need to embrace different methodology, and Hao Li is one of the wonderful example leaders who embrace different methodology in terms of diversity in methodology. The second type of diversity is about different groups in terms of race, in terms of religion, gender, and whatnot. So if you look at Hao Li's co-authors, he actually co-authored with many people in terms of women, in terms of different racial groups. And also he served on different panels. I had the privilege to serve on a couple of panels with him about women in OM or women in OR panels. And I think that we talk about how we should embrace different gender in our community. And then lastly, I think that I know that recently he is also very active in speaking up about hate crimes against Asians at Stanford University. So I think that this is what I think a leader would have said to a certain extent today if she was able to share her thought with me. But that is what I'd like to share with you. Now we have the last speaker. This is Professor Eric Johnson. He's the Dean of the Owen School at the Vanderbilt University. And then he's also to try to get a closer look. We start with bullwhip effect to AAA supply chain. Now we go back to the point of origin is how bullwhip also related to risk analysis. Here's Eric Johnson.
It is such a pleasure and just a great privilege to be able to contribute to this special POMS session in honor of Hao Li. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about risk and risk rating and just the inspiration that Hao has been for my career and so many others. My time with Hao goes back to a doctoral seminar at Stanford on inventory. And of course, that was an early introduction to managing risk, in that case, inventory risk. But my time with Hao continued really throughout my career. Some highlights being years and years that we worked together on a team called Fulfill Demand for Accenture. And every month I got the great privilege of watching Hao in action, learning from him, learning how he thought about problems, and learning how he thought about risk. And certainly risk is a theme that runs through all of Hao's work. It really is a theme that runs through all of our business life. I tell my business school students all the time that really risk is a framework for an MBA education, whether you're thinking about finance or marketing or operations. Risk is a theme that runs through every part of their time in an MBA program. And of course, along the way, many of them are taking personal risks and evaluating those risks in their own life. Well, that all starts with thinking about some of the lessons I learned from Hao. And Hao has studied risks in almost every aspect of operations and supply chain. Places like the Japanese earthquake that had a huge impact on electronics manufacturers, or Starbucks and the risk of a supplier that may not be responsible and create tremendous operating risk. And of course, bullwhip. The last year has taught us more about bullwhip and given us more examples for our classrooms than almost any period of time I can remember. And of course, Hal was at the very beginning of bullwhip. But this last year certainly has been a special lesson around that. And it never got more personal than when it came to toilet paper.
The US is used to making and selling more than 7 billion pounds of toilet paper a year. So how did shelves end up looking like this? When the coronavirus pandemic hit, toilet paper sales in the US jumped by 845%. We're talking $1.45 billion in sales in just 1 month. Look familiar?
Well, it certainly does look familiar, right? I think we all experienced that bullwhip. And the things that Hal taught us all the way back in his Sloan Management Review article, where he really categorized these key causes of bullwhip, things that I've taught year in and year out, like many of you, to MBA students in supply chain classes, causes like demand signaling, order batching, price fluctuation, metrics, and shortage gaming. Certainly as a dean, I've learned a little bit about shortage gaming. And working with faculty, I think about those lessons all the time and how to prevent faculty from shortage gaming and worrying about hoarding and all these kinds of things. All great lessons from the bullwhip. But there's so many more. And, you know, when I think about risk, one of the areas of my own personal research the last few years has been around trying to rate risk, to come up with ways of thinking about rating risk. Something Hal had been thinking about for years. And we're so used to seeing it in different places, whether it be financial markets or walking into a restaurant and seeing their rating proudly displayed on a window, or maybe not so proudly displayed, as it were. Those ratings, of course, exist in supply chains, and some really interesting cases, things that Hal had thought about how to really build a great low-cost country supply chain, how to operate in a country like China with a supply chain, certifications, binary certifications, ratings. Of course, now there are companies that are springing up that are addressing that to try to build supply ratings. And what that rating would mean for manufacturers, for supply chains. And one of the things I started getting interested in thinking about was, what did it mean for vendor competition? And who were the winners and the losers? And what were the viable kind of revenue markets that would make ratings work like they would for Moody's or S&P in financial markets? I did some research on that along with some of my colleagues. One of the article was published a few years ago in POMS, and it was really looking at supplier risk rating and its impact on competition, how it affected competition, and how it helped individuals, how it increased social welfare, things like that. More recently, I've become really interested in cyber risk because we see that all around us. And while I've studied it in many different places, the healthcare sector has become my most recent passion, where I spend most of my time. And I started out thinking about healthcare because we were seeing so much medical identity theft and financial fraud happening in healthcare, and following the money trail of cyber risk into healthcare. But more recently, that risk became, in some sense, much more compelling and frightening as we started to see the cyber risk creeping into things like medical devices and the ability to impact a medical device in a hospital setting that might actually impact patients. And even over this last year, we've watched hospital after hospital be attacked with things like ransomware that really, truly disrupted healthcare. In a recent paper with a colleague of mine, Sung Choi, we were looking at what the impact of breaches were on health outcomes. And we found that actually breaches, and particularly the remediation effort that came afterwards, many times slowed hospitals down, particularly in places like emergency rooms with conditions like heart attacks. We found that there actually was a mortality link, that breaches did lead to deaths through a circuitous route called time. How long did it take to get to the EKG machine? And if that time was lengthened, how would that impact patients? All of those things together keep me thinking a lot about risk rating. And over the last few years, I've been studying a firm called BitSight and some of the cyber risk rating they've been doing, and trying to understand if it really was predictive in healthcare. And some of my current work, one of the papers I hope to be publishing later this year, we look at BitSight's cyber risk rating, which looks a lot like a credit rating, an external rating of a vendor. In this case, we were looking at thousands of hospitals in the US, hundreds of breaches in those hospitals, and linking them to see if we could see association with the rating and the breach, whether those two were connected. And sure enough, we do find that hospitals with low ratings, and the BitSight uses a rating score that runs kind of from 0 to 8, 900, big being good. So 8, 900 being great ratings, 2, 300 being not such great cyber risk ratings. And we found that sure enough, they are predictive. That is, that security rating is clearly associated with the probability of a breach, of a real impact to that hospital. All of those lessons around risk, and all of them inspired in many ways by the great work of Hao Li. So thank you, Hao. Congratulations on an amazing career. And we're just so excited to celebrate with you. It is such a pleasure and just a great privilege.
Wow, thank you, Eric. That is a really very interesting talk. To talk about how this work from the bull effect and also in terms of how it related to risk management. Now, I think that this is very interesting instead of focusing on risk. So now I'm going to invite Hao Li to give the closing remarks about how risk can turn into opportunities. So I'm going to stop the share, and then I'm going to invite Hao Li to give a closing remarks before I give my last comment. Hao, it's all yours.
Well, thanks very much, Chris. I really want to thank you first. You have organized such a event that I learned so much from my colleagues as well, even though I also feel very privileged and honored to receive those kind words. I thought of in today's supply chain world, people, McKinsey and many of the leading think tanks have emphasized the need to have an ecosystem innovation based on an ecosystem instead of a single company. And I think that in academics, we already have practiced that. I have a big ecosystem. I thank all my colleagues and friends, former students, and my advisors, mentors, and just collaborators, all the inspirations that they have given me and the ideas that they have provided me is how I was enriched and be able to walk my academic journey. So I want to thank my ecosystem, and you're all my ecosystem. It's a big network. And through that ecosystem, we can pick up ideas, and that's exactly, and the ecosystem consists of more than just academic friends. There are many industry leaders and friends that I know, and they have been able to give me such inspirations and ideas. So ecosystem, I want to thank my ecosystem, thank my friends, and in particular, today, some of them have such kind words about me, and also I learn from their continuing research as well. So thank you, Chris, for organizing this session to enrich all of us.
Thank you, Hao. Ladies and gentlemen, we have learned from all the speakers about Hao Li's success recipe. Now, and also we learned from Hao about the new idea about ecosystem, and also some of the many lessons we learned from him. So I think that it inspires us to follow Hao Li's footsteps to create more value to our OM community as well as to the society at large. And last but not least, I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for the privilege of your time. And I hope that I can see you in person soon, and be safe and be well. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Jay, and thanks, Hao.
Thank you.
In the time that you were talking, Chris and Hao, I wrote up a short blog post that I will send you to honor Hao Li from my perspective. So, Kalyan, if you want to send that out to the POMS community, you can do so. It's going to be rough because I kind of did it as you were finishing, but hopefully it'll bring up some aspects of interactions with Hao I've had over 20 years, and also show you some movies that I like. Okay, so I'll send this out to you guys, but this is a great session and it's wonderful to know you, Hao. And
thanks, Jay.
It's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hao. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Sushil.
Carol. Thanks, Sushil. Thanks, Carol.
It was very
Thanks, Chris,
scary.
for taking the leadership on this and just doing such a spectacular, session for
No, thank you. It was so
all of
scary.
us,
You know what
and
happened?
for also for Hao. So it's really very well done.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm so glad it worked, because I had to switch computer because I did not have time to load up the videos on my big computer, and I had to use my little notebook. Then it has limited RAM, so that's why the video is not as good, because I ran out of time. I cannot run load up the video, but it's okay. So it worked. So I was worried.
Hey, Chris.
Yes.
If you can stay on, I think Lynn would like to say thank you to you.
Oh, Lynn,
Thank you so
thank
much,
you.
Chris. I was on the other computer.
Yes, it is my privilege. I was telling the audience that is the second half, because I need to switch computer because I did not have enough time, because it's only 7 minutes. I cannot load the video. So that's why I use a notebook computer, and I'm glad that it worked.
So it's been a great session. Thank you. And I appreciate many of the colleagues' very warm words, as well as showing their respective research. And I also thank many of the attendants. I could recognize many of the faces, and they are all great friends.
Yes.
They're wonderful colleagues that I feel very honored and privileged. Chris?
No, it is really a privilege and honor to do this, and I really enjoyed it. That's why I'm very grateful to Sushil for allowing me to do this, and also I thank Kalyan to invited me to add a special issue. So Lynn, now you can listen to how people really appreciate what Hao has inspired us and many others to do different great work. So that's why that the poster I sent you is actually I think it really captures how we feel about Hao. So he's truly a unique person, and also want to thank you for supporting him for so many years.
Thank you and everyone for all your support for Hao. Yeah, we really appreciate you and everyone.
No, thank you. This was originally we planned to have a in-person conference in Atlanta. So we planned it 2 years ago, right? Then you were so kind to say, okay, you accompany Hao to come, but it's okay. We end up doing virtually. But then I think there's also can involve more people from around the world as well.
Well, I still hope that one day, very soon, that I can sit down and have a nice lunch or dinner with some nice wine with friends like Jay and Lee and Suresh. We have to get together, and Corey, of course, yeah, and then many others, yeah.
Exactly. So I think that,
Maybe
well,
we can do that in the
soon.
Informs conference in September, possibly. In Anaheim, who knows?
That's
But
right.
We don't know.
great to see all of you. I miss all of you. I miss traveling, as you know, and how it was a great meeting, and Chris organized a wonderful meeting for this group. And how again, congratulations for all this.
Oh, thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Yeah, so we have something to look forward to. Yeah. Okay, so I think that you guys have to get ready for the next session now. Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
All right.
Well, take
Later.
care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, take care. Take care. Bye-bye. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Bye.
Chris, it went really well. So.
Oh, thank you so much.